The moment you start explaining yourself too much, you stop living freely. And the moment your choices need approval to feel valid, you've already given away your power. Because a life that constantly needs explanation is a life that's quietly asking for permission.
Welcome to True Stoic Journal, the path to inner control.
Stop explaining yourself. Stoic lesson on inner authority. There's a behavior most people don't even realize they're repeating. It doesn't look harmful. In fact, it often looks polite. It shows up in small, everyday moments. When you say no, but then explain why. When you make a decision, but then justify it. When you express a feeling, but then soften it. At first, it feels like communication. But if you look deeper, it's not really about clarity. It's about permission. Somewhere along the way, my choice stopped feeling enough. And it started feeling like something that needed to be accepted, understood, or approved. And that's where the shift begins. Quietly. Almost invisibly. You stop acting from certainty, and start acting from anticipation. You begin to think ahead. How will they react? Will they misunderstand me? Should I explain more? Your mind starts preparing responses before anything even happens. And slowly, your life stops being about choosing. It becomes about managing perception. And that is exhausting. Not physically, but mentally. Because now every decision carries an extra weight. Not just, what do I want, but how do I make this acceptable? And over time, that weight grows. You begin to feel uncomfortable being misunderstood. Not because it's dangerous, but because it feels unsettling. It lingers. And that discomfort teaches you something subtle. It teaches you to avoid misunderstanding at all costs. So you explain more. Clarify more. Adjust more. And without realizing it, you begin reshaping your truth. Not because it's wrong, but because it needs to be accepted. And every time you do that, you move a little further away from yourself. Because now your experience isn't enough on its own. It needs validation. It needs confirmation. It needs agreement. And slowly, your internal authority weakens. Not all at once. But in small, repeated moments. This is where the real tension begins. Because now you're not just living, you're negotiating. Every thought gets filtered. Every emotion gets edited. Every decision gets rehearsed. And even when nothing is happening, your mind is still preparing. Still adjusting. Still managing. The Stoics understood this clearly. They saw that most human discomfort comes from placing importance on things we don't control. And one of the biggest of those things is how others see us. Because no matter how clearly you explain yourself, you cannot control how you are understood. You can say everything perfectly, and still be misunderstood. You can act with clarity, and still be judged. And if your peace depends on avoiding that, your peace will never be stable. Because you are trying to control something that was never yours to control. That's why this pattern is so draining. You are investing energy into perception, instead of grounding yourself in truth. You begin reacting instead of deciding. Adjusting instead of choosing. And slowly, your life becomes shaped by what is acceptable, instead of what is real. But something powerful happens the moment you step out of this pattern. At first, it feels uncomfortable. You say less. You stop adding extra explanations. You let your decisions stand on their own. And in that moment, something unfamiliar appears. Silence. Not just around you, but inside you. The constant mental noise begins to fade. Even if only slightly. And that silence feels strange. Because for the first time, you're not cushioning yourself with explanation. You're standing in your choices, without defense. And that requires something deeper than confidence. It requires internal authority. The kind that doesn't come from being understood, but from being aligned with yourself. The Stoics believed in this kind of grounding. They believed that a person should be rooted in their own judgment. Not shaped by approval. Not controlled by reaction. But guided by reason and values. And that kind of stability doesn't come from explaining yourself better. It comes from needing to explain yourself less. From trusting that your choices are valid, even when they are not fully understood. And as that trust grows, something begins to shift. Not just internally, but externally. Your presence changes. You are no longer trying to convince. No longer trying to be accepted. You simply exist, as you are. And people feel that. Some will resist it. They'll question you more. Push you. Try to pull yourself back into old patterns. Because they are used to the version of you that explained everything. That adjusted. That made things easier to accept. But now, that pattern is gone. And that changes the dynamic. Because when you stop explaining yourself constantly, you stop giving others control over your identity. There is less to analyze. Less to reshape. Less to influence. And that can feel uncomfortable, not just for you, but for them. But there are others, who will respond differently. They will sense something. A quiet clarity. A calm confidence. A presence that doesn't need to justify itself. And that presence carries weight. Because there is something powerful about someone who does not feel the need to defend their existence. Not loud power. Not aggressive. But steady. Grounded. Unshaken. And that kind of presence creates respect. Not because you demanded it, but because you embodied it. This is where a deeper realization begins. Respect is not gained through explanation. It is felt through alignment. Through the way you carry yourself when you stop negotiating your place in the world. And over time, the need to explain begins to disappear. Not because you are trying to prove something, but because there is nothing left to prove. You trust your decisions. You accept your emotions. You allow yourself to exist without constant validation. And in that state, something shifts. You are no longer asking to be understood. You are no longer adjusting your truth. You are simply present. And paradoxically, it's in that moment, when you stop trying to be understood, that people begin to understand you more clearly. Because your words are no longer carrying pressure. They are not trying to convince. They are simply expressing. And that makes them stronger. Cleaner. More real. At the end of all this, there is one question that remains: what happens when you stop negotiating with yourself? When you allow your choices to exist without explanation? Not as rebellion, but as trust. Trust in your judgment. Your perspective. Your values. Because the truth is simple, the more you rely on others to validate your choices, the less stable those choices will feel. And the more you learn to stand in your decisions, without needing them to be accepted, the more grounded you become. Not because others suddenly agree with you, but because you no longer need them to. And that is freedom. Not from people. Not from situations. But from the constant need to be approved. At some point, you realize something that changes everything: you were never meant to explain your existence. You were meant to live it. And the moment you stop asking for permission, is the moment you finally start becoming yourself. If this shifted your perspective, don't just scroll past it. Subscribe to the channel. Because here, we don't teach you how to be accepted. We teach you how to stand without needing to be.